It started with silence, the kind of silence that doesn't comfort you, but presses down heavy, like a storm holding its breath. The late afternoon sun spilled across my living room, painting the walls gold, yet somehow the light felt distant, as if the house itself was waiting for something. I remember sitting there staring at the old brass key on the table, the key to my front door. Simple, ordinary, a piece of metal no bigger than my thumb, but that day it felt heavier than 1,000 pounds. That key had always been a symbol of safety, of home, of belonging. I didn't know yet that it was about to become the center of a story I would never forget. You ever feel like someone is watching your life not to support you but to control it? To twist it into something that suits their power? That's the feeling of living under the thumb of an HOA president like Karen. A woman with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, with eyes that didn't see neighbors but saw territory. She wasn't much older than me, yet she carried herself like a queen ruling over unwilling subjects. Some people live for kindness, others live for control. And Karen was the second kind. That day, the silence was broken by the sound of my front doorknob turning. Not knocking, not ringing the bell, but the metallic click of someone pushing past a boundary that should never be crossed. My gaze snapped to that old brass key on the table and my stomach dropped. I knew. The lock had been turned from the outside. My sanctuary wasn't mine anymore. I froze, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. There's a certain kind of pain you can't scream about, a pain that makes you silent, makes your breath catch in your throat. That was my gaze moment, my silent scream as the door eased open and the shadow of Karen stretched long across my floorboards. She stepped in like she owned the place, her perfume sharp, her heels tapping against the wood like a countdown. She looked around my home, my space, with an arrogance that stung. To her, this wasn't breaking in. This was checking up. This was authority. She had no right, but people like her believe rights bend around them. And then, with that smirk she wore like a mask, she pulled out her phone and dialed. Her voice cut through the air, loud enough for the walls to carry. "Yes, police? I need you here immediately." It was almost laughable. She had broken into my house, and yet she was calling the cops on me. But there was nothing funny in that moment. It was bitter, twisted, surreal. I kept staring at that brass key on the table, realizing how fragile the illusion of safety really is. There's something poetic about timing, about the way life bends in ways you don't expect. Because while Karen's voice echoed with false authority, another sound rose from the back of the house, the quiet, steady rhythm of boots, a rhythm I knew by heart. My wife stepped into the doorway from the hallway, her uniform catching the late sunlight, her badge glinting like fire. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. Her gaze alone carried the weight of justice, the weight of truth. Karen turned, expecting an ally in blue, but what she saw froze her mid-sentence. The phone slipped slightly in her hand, her mouth open but words failing her. It was a moment painted in slow motion, every detail etched into memory. The sunlight on the brass key, the half-open door swaying like a pendulum, Karen's face draining of confidence, and my wife, standing tall, the very embodiment of authority that Karen pretended to have. But here's the thing. This story isn't just about Karen being shocked, or about cops being called to the wrong house. It's about something deeper, about how fragile power becomes when faced with truth, about how control crumbles when it collides with integrity. It's about the invisible battles that happen in neighborhoods, battles over pride, over space, over respect. I want you to think about something for a second. What does home mean to you? Is it walls and doors? Or is it the feeling of safety when you close your eyes at night? Because in that instant, when Karen unlocked my door without asking, I realized home isn't just a place. It's a promise. A promise we protect fiercely. And sometimes, the ones we need to protect it from aren't strangers in the dark. They're neighbors in daylight. This story will twist in ways you don't expect. The brass key on the table will come back again. The silence that started the day will return before the end. And somewhere in the middle there will be loss, and there will be rebirth. But I won't resolve any of that now. For now, I'll leave you with this picture. A woman who thought she owned power standing face to face with someone who was power. A door half open, caught between trespass and truth. A house that had been broken into, but in that very same instant was never stronger. And I can't help but wonder, if you were in my place, watching it all unfold, what would you have done? Would you have confronted Karen right then and there, or let the silence speak for itself? Tell me in the comments, because this story isn't just mine. It belongs to every single one of us who has ever been pushed past our limit by someone who thought they could control us. Karen's face stayed frozen, like time itself had betrayed her. The phone in her hand still clung to her ear. The police operator's faint voice asking questions she could no longer answer. My wife didn't move, not right away. She just stood there in her uniform, calm but sharp, the way only years of training could carve into someone. The silence stretched again. That same silence from earlier. But this time it felt charged. Alive, like the air before lightning cracks. I should have spoken, but I didn't. Instead, I drifted inward. Pulled back to another time when boundaries were crossed. When someone tried to take what didn't belong to them. I remembered a summer years ago, long before this neighborhood, long before Karen, when I was still renting a rundown place with peeling paint and a landlord who believed the rules bent around him. He had walked into my apartment without knocking, claiming he was just checking the pipes. I'd stood there powerless, clutching the same brass key I kept with me even now. That day I felt like nothing in my own home. The humiliation burned so deep I swore it would never happen again. And yet here I was, years later, in a better house, with a stronger life, watching history replay itself through a different face. That's when the contradictions hit me. Maybe Karen believed she was protecting the neighborhood, keeping things in order, even if her methods were twisted. Maybe, in her mind, calling the cops wasn't an abuse of power, but her warped version of justice. People rarely see themselves as villains. They write their own stories where they are the saviors. And in her story, I was the threat. The flashback broke when Karen's lips finally parted. You can't... Her voice cracked, weaker than I'd ever heard it. She dropped the phone to her side, the call still connected, her authority slipping through her fingers like sand. This is against regulations, she stammered, trying to rebuild the wall of control she had always stood behind. My wife finally spoke. Her tone was low, steady, and sharp enough to slice the air. You entered this home without permission. You called officers under false pretenses. Do you realize what you've done? Karen blinked, her mouth twitching like she wanted to fight back, but the words refused to line up. And for just a second, just a flicker, I saw something human in her. Fear. Not fear of being caught, but fear of losing everything she built her identity on. Because what is someone like Karen without control, without the crown of authority? Nothing but a neighbor with too much time and too little kindness. Still, even as fear glimmered in her eyes, another layer showed itself. Defiance. She straightened her shoulders, her voice trembling but stubborn. This community relies on me. I do what's necessary to protect it. If you won't follow the rules, someone has to enforce them. It was absurd, but also painfully real. Karen wasn't just being cruel for the sake of cruelty. She believed this was her duty. Her contradiction lay bare in front of us. A woman doing what she thought was right, even if it meant shattering every boundary of decency. My wife stepped closer, her boots tapping once, a sound that echoed in my bones. "And who protects the neighbors from you?" she asked, her gaze never breaking. That question hung in the room like smoke. Karen's lips pressed thin. She turned toward me then, as if I would somehow validate her, side with her, confess that deep down she was justified. But I stayed silent, my eyes drifting back to that brass key still lying on the table. That key had protected me once, but it had failed me now, and in its reflection I saw the truth. Power means nothing when someone believes they're above it. The tension thickened until the silence itself felt unbearable. That's when the police operator's voice, still faint from the dangling phone, broke through. "Ma'am, do you require assistance?" Karen's hand shook. She ended the call without a word. What followed wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet where everyone knows the fight isn't over, just delayed. Karen turned on her heel, her heels clicking hard, the rhythm angry this time. She stopped at the doorway, her hand gripping the frame like she was holding herself up. Without turning back, she muttered, "This isn't finished." Then she stepped out, leaving the door wide open, swinging on its hinges, mocking the idea of safety. My wife locked it behind her, sliding the brass key back into place, but the damage was done. Safety isn't a lock, it's trust, and both had been shattered. That night, the memory of her shadow on my floorboards replayed over and over. I thought of the contradiction again. How Karen's intrusion was wrong, but in her heart, she truly believed she was right. It made me wonder, how many people have been crushed under the weight of good intentions gone bad? How many times has justice been twisted until it looked like control? But my wife knew better than to let the quiet linger too long. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and leaned close, her voice softer now. "This isn't just about today," she said. "She's testing boundaries. Next time, it'll be worse." Her words dragged me back to another buried memory, one I'd tried to forget. A neighbor from my childhood, a man who everyone thought was harmless until the day he wasn't. He started small, borrowing tools without asking, cutting across our yard like it belonged to him. My father brushed it off, saying, "Don't stir trouble." But then one day he took more than tools, more than space, and the fallout left scars that never healed. I swore back then that I'd never let someone chip away at my life piece by piece, and yet, here I was again watching the pieces shift under Karen's weight. Days passed, but the air in the neighborhood changed. Neighbors I once waved to began glancing away, conversations cutting short when I approached. The HOA newsletter arrived, and for the first time, my name was written in it. Resident in violation of community cooperation. Karen's voice, disguised as formality, dripping with accusation. She was playing the long game now, not just breaking into doors, but breaking into reputations. The contradiction deepened. She painted herself as the guardian of peace, while sowing division. She smiled at neighbors while planting seeds of mistrust. Good for bad reasons, or bad for good ones. Maybe even she didn't know anymore. One evening I caught her standing across the street, her arms crossed, staring at my house. Not sneaky, not ashamed, bold as if daring me to challenge her. My wife stood beside me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder, her badge tucked away but her presence a shield. And that's when I realized this wasn't about one unlocked door, one phone call, one uniform. It was about territory, about dominance. But here's the part I didn't see coming. That night, as I locked up and placed the brass key back on the table, I noticed something new. A folded note slid under the door. I opened it with cautious fingers, the handwriting sharp, deliberate. It read, "You think you've won because of her uniform. But uniforms come off, rules stay. Next time I won't call the cops. I'll bring the board." The threat wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. But it was worse. It was a promise that the battle had only just begun. Not in my living room, but in meetings, votes, papers, the kind of war fought in whispers and signatures. I sat there staring at the note, the brass key beside it, and I felt the storm building again. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about every hand she could pull into her web, every neighbor she could turn, every false smile she could twist into power. And as the night deepened, a single question burned in my mind. What happens when the real danger isn't the intruder at your door, but the one who convinces everyone else that you're the problem? The note sat on the table all night, its words burning into me more than any lockpick or broken door could. I kept staring at it as though it might change, as though the sharp, deliberate handwriting might suddenly soften. But it didn't. It stayed the same, steady, cold, promising that what had begun inside my home was only the surface of something deeper, something that wouldn't stop until every corner of my life was twisted into Karen's idea of control. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak in the house made me twitch. Every shadow stretching across the walls made me wonder if she was watching again. My wife slept beside me, steady and calm, the way only someone trained for storms can rest. But I lay awake, my chest tight, fighting thoughts that clawed at me in the dark. What if Karen wasn't just bluffing? What if she actually managed to turn the whole neighborhood against us? What if my wife's uniform, her badge, her presence wasn't enough to hold back the slow poison of Karen's influence? By morning, the weight of it all sat heavy in my chest. I tried to brush it off, to act normal, but my hands shook as I poured coffee. The brass key clinked when I set it on the table beside the folded note, a sound too loud for such a small object. My wife caught me staring and said nothing, just squeezed my shoulder before heading out for her shift. She didn't need words. Her silence was a kind of trust, but that trust made me feel heavier, like I had to be strong when all I felt inside was breaking. The hours dragged. Every time I passed a window, I imagined eyes on me, curtains shifting, whispers forming. That's the cruelest part of being under scrutiny. It makes you doubt things that used to feel safe. I even started questioning myself. Maybe Karen wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe I had pushed too hard, stood too firm, when I could have just bowed my head and kept the peace like so many others did. Maybe my stubbornness would drag my wife into fights she didn't deserve. Guilt crawled inside me, twisting every memory until even my own anger felt like a flaw. But then I'd remember her shadow crossing my floor, her hand on my doorknob, her voice calling the cops on me in my own house. And the guilt would swing back to rage. That was my inner battle, shame pulling one way, fury pulling the other, tearing me in two. It was in that raw space, when doubt and anger collided, that I made a decision. Not the smartest one, maybe not even the right one, but the kind you make when you're desperate to take control back. I walked across the street. Karen's house looked like every other on the block. Trimmed lawn, perfect shutters, the illusion of harmony. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might shake the wood. I should have turned back. But something in me snapped. I knocked. The door opened not to Karen, but to a man I'd never seen before. Tall, wiry, a little older than me, with tired eyes that studied me cautiously. He didn't wear the same arrogance Karen carried. He looked worn, like someone dragged into a storm he never asked for. "You must be the neighbor," he said quietly. His voice wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. Just tired. I nodded. I need to talk to her. He hesitated, then stepped aside. She's in the back. As I stepped into the house, I noticed something unexpected. The smell of cinnamon, faint but warm. Family photos on the walls. Karen smiling with 2 kids I hadn't even known existed. A younger version of her with bright eyes before they hardened. There was a contradiction here I hadn't imagined. The woman who stormed my house, who threatened me, who poisoned my name in newsletters. She was also a mother, someone's wife, someone's daughter. The realization shook me, just enough to plant another seed of doubt. She appeared from the back room, still in her sharp blazer, her hair pinned too tightly, her expression stiff. But for a moment when she saw me standing in her home, her eyes flickered with something softer. Surprise, maybe fear. Then the mask snapped back on. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "I came to understand why," I said, the words blurting out before I could polish them. "Why break into my house? Why call the cops? Why this crusade?" Her husband stood silently, arms crossed, watching the space between us. Karen scoffed. "You wouldn't get it. You don't care about this community like I do." "Community?" I laughed bitterly. "You call it community, but it's control. You think rules are worth more than respect?" Something in her face cracked then, just a sliver. She took a step closer, her voice rising, almost shaking. "Do you think I like this? Do you think I wanted to become the one everyone hates? Do you know what it's like to hold everything together when no one else will?" Her words hit me harder than I expected, because in them I heard desperation. Not just hunger for control, but fear of losing it all. And maybe, in her twisted way, she believed she was protecting something fragile. Maybe her cruelty came from panic, not malice. But then I remembered the note. The threat she slid under my door, and the sympathy curdled. "You crossed into my home," I said firmly, voice low. "You put my wife, my family, in the line of your obsession. That's not protection. That's abuse." Her husband shifted uncomfortably. His eyes, tired but kind, met mine. "She's not wrong about the pressure," he said softly, almost apologetically. "But she goes too far. Always too far." For a brief second, I felt a strange kinship with him. Both of us caught in her storm. Both of us holding the weight of her choices. But the difference was clear. He lived inside the eye of it while I was just being dragged in. Karen's jaw tightened. "You'll regret stepping into my house," she snapped, her mask fully back in place. "The board will hear about this." I left without another word, the cinnamon smell following me out like a ghost. Back home, I collapsed onto the couch, my chest aching from the storm inside. I'd seen her humanity, her contradictions, her cracks, but I'd also seen her threat harden again. And that left me torn. Do I fight her openly, risking my wife's peace, risking my own standing? Or do I stay quiet, bend my pride, let her win small battles to keep the bigger war from burning everything? That was my breaking point, the place where anger and guilt, empathy and hatred all collided into a mess I couldn't untangle. And it was in that breaking point that another player stepped into the story. Late that evening, a knock rattled my door. My stomach dropped. I expected Karen, another confrontation, another intrusion. But when I opened it, I found someone else. A woman about my age standing with a clipboard and a faint smile. "I'm Lisa," she said. "Vice President of the HOA. We need to talk." Her presence was different. Calm, collected, without Karen's sharp edges. She stepped inside when I offered, glancing around with an expression that was more curious than judgmental. "I've heard things," she admitted, lowering her voice. "Not all of them true. I wanted to see for myself." She listened as I told her everything. the intrusion, the phone call, the note. Her face shifted with each detail, sometimes frowning, sometimes sighing like someone who wasn't surprised but still disappointed. Finally, she spoke. Karen thinks she's holding the line, but sometimes she makes enemies where she should make allies. I'm not here to defend her, but I am here to warn you. If you push too hard, she'll twist it. And the board listens to her more than you realize. Her words landed heavy, a mirror to my own doubts. Another contradiction. Someone inside the same machine, quietly resisting but not openly fighting. She wasn't my enemy, but she wasn't free either. Before she left, she said one last thing. Decide carefully. Do you want to beat her or do you want to survive her? They're not the same. That question haunted me long after she was gone, because she was right. Every choice now was a gamble. Every risk could backfire. And then, just when I thought the night had settled, the next blow came. A loud knock thundered against the door, heavier, urgent. I opened it expecting Lisa again, but instead I saw two uniformed officers, flashlights cutting through the dark. "Sir," one of them said firmly, "we received a report of a disturbance at this address. We'll need to come inside." My stomach dropped. My wife wasn't home yet, and standing in that doorway, staring at the badges, I realized the truth. Karen hadn't given up. She had escalated. And this time it wasn't a bluff or a note. It was real consequences backed by law. The storm had found its way back into my home, and I knew the breaking point I'd been dreading was here. The beam of the officers' flashlights swept across my living room like searchlights, catching every corner, every surface, making my own home feel foreign. The brass key still sat on the table, glinting under the sudden brightness like it was mocking me. A reminder that locks and doors meant nothing anymore. I stepped back, letting them in because what else could I do? Refusing would only make things worse. One of the officers, tall and expressionless, started asking questions in a flat tone. "We got a report of shouting, possible disturbance. Can you tell us what happened here tonight?" His voice was calm, but I could feel the weight behind it, the unspoken suspicion. I swallowed hard. "There's no disturbance. No shouting. Someone's making false reports about me." The other officer glanced around, his eyes sharp, pausing at the note on the table. He didn't pick it up, but I saw the flicker in his expression. Curiosity, doubt, maybe even recognition. They exchanged a look, the kind that says more than words. Karen's shadow was all over this. She had finally pulled law enforcement directly into the game. And here I was, alone, my wife still not back from her shift, standing under the scrutiny of two strangers who had the power to twist this night into something I might not come back from. I wanted to shout, to tell them everything, to pour out the months of pressure, the threats, the intrusion, the lies. But the words jammed in my throat, because I knew how it would sound. A neighbor dispute, a homeowner lashing out, an HOA president doing her job. People like Karen know how to bend stories until truth looks like rebellion. The officers walked through the house, checking each room, their radios crackling softly. Every step they took felt like they were trampling deeper into my life, turning private space into public ground. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms, fighting the urge to scream at them to get out. That would only give her what she wanted. Me looking unhinged, unstable, a man out of control. When they finally circled back to the living room, the taller officer wrote something down in a small pad. "We didn't find anything," he said, still expressionless. "But if we get another call, we'll have to take it more seriously. You understand? That word, seriously, hung in the air like a blade. They left without cuffs, without charges, but the damage was done. Karen had planted the seed and the soil was ready. Next time, it might not matter whether anything happened or not. I locked the door after them, my hands shaking so hard I could barely turn the brass key. When the lock clicked, it didn't sound like safety. It sounded like a countdown. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. The weight of it pressed harder than ever, heavier than the night she first stepped into my home. It wasn't just Karen anymore. It was the system, the police, the neighbors who looked away when I passed. It was the feeling that no matter what I did, I was being pushed toward an edge I couldn't step back from. When my wife finally came home, the sight of her uniform should have been a comfort. But all I felt was dread. I told her what happened, my voice breaking in places I couldn't hide. She listened, her jaw tightening, her eyes sharp but quiet. When I finished, she sat across from me, her hands folded like she was holding something fragile. "She's not stopping," she said softly. "She's setting you up. Next time, they won't just walk through. Next time, they'll take you." The words carved into me deep and raw. "So what do I do?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. "Do I let her win? Do I just keep my head down and let her run over me?" My wife's silence was heavier than any answer. Finally, she said, "You have to choose. Either you bend or you fight. But if you fight, you need to understand, once you do, there's no going back." That was the breaking line, the edge I had been trying not to see. Because deep down, I knew she was right. Every step forward from here would carry consequences that couldn't be undone. The next morning, the HOA meeting notice arrived in my mailbox, printed in neat black ink with Karen's name bold at the bottom. "Mandatory attendance," it read. The timing was no accident. She was drawing the battle line, forcing me into her arena, where rules bent in her favor and witnesses became weapons. I stood in my kitchen holding that paper, the brass key pressing into my palm from my pocket, the note from Karen still folded on the table. Every piece of it pointed to one truth. The confrontation was coming whether I wanted it or not. The day of the meeting, the community hall buzzed with voices, polite laughter that didn't reach the eyes, whispers that stopped when I walked in. Karen sat at the head of the table, her blazer crisp, her smile sharp, flanked by board members who looked more like loyal courtiers than neighbors. And there was Lisa, the vice president, sitting quietly at the side, her expression unreadable. I sat down, every eye on me, the air thick with expectation. Karen opened the meeting with her usual polished tone, talking about safety and community standards, each word dripping with control disguised as concern. Then, inevitably, she shifted to me. "One of our residents," she said smoothly, "has shown repeated disregard for the values of this neighborhood. Police have already been called, and I fear it won't be the last time." A murmur ran through the crowd. My pulse pounded in my ears. I could feel the room tilting against me, her words sinking into minds like seeds in soil. I should have stayed quiet. That would have been the safe choice. But something inside me snapped. The months of silence, of watching her twist reality, of seeing neighbors turn away, it all broke loose at once. I stood. My voice shook at first, but then it grew louder, steadier. "You talk about safety, about community, but you broke into my home. You called the police on lies. You've turned neighbors into enemies because you crave control. That's not leadership. That's abuse." The room erupted in whispers, gasps, shifting bodies. Karen's smile faltered for the first time, her mask slipping just enough to show the rage underneath. "This is exactly what I mean," she snapped, her voice sharp now, no longer polished. "Aggression, defiance, this is why rules matter. This is why people like him can't be trusted." Her words hit like stones, but I didn't sit down. I felt the burn of every eye on me, half judging, half curious, some maybe even agreeing. The air thickened. the moment stretching into something that felt bigger than the room itself. Lisa spoke then, her voice calm but firm. Maybe what we need is balance. Maybe power isn't about control, but respect. It was the first time anyone had openly challenged Karen. The room shifted again, not enough to topple her, but enough to shake her grip. Karen's eyes narrowed at Lisa, then at me. And in that moment I saw it, the decision forming in her mind. If she couldn't silence me with rules, she would escalate again. And this time, she wouldn't stop until she destroyed me completely. I walked out of the meeting before it ended, the whispers chasing me down the hall. My wife followed, her hand brushing mine, steadying me. But I could see the fear in her eyes, too, because she knew what I had just done. I had crossed the line. I had stood against Karen in her own arena, in front of her board, in front of the community she controlled. There was no going back now. That night, I sat alone in the dark, the brass key turning over in my hand, the weight of it cutting into my skin. I thought of every choice, every silence, every outburst. I thought of Karen's eyes narrowing, the way her mask slipped, the way her threat had grown each time I resisted. And then, just past midnight, the sound came. A loud crack against my window, the sharp shatter of glass spilling into the room. I jumped, heart racing, the key clattering to the floor. Outside, in the shadows, I thought I saw a figure watching before vanishing into the night. The air rushed out of me in a single breath. This wasn't just words anymore. This wasn't just newsletters or meetings or notes under the door. The fight had spilled out into something physical, something raw, something that could not be undone. And in that broken glass, with the brass key lying useless on the floor, I knew the darkest moment had arrived. The turning point I could never step back from. The silence after that night felt different, almost as if the walls themselves were holding secrets I wasn't ready to face. The air inside the house was heavy, every step echoing with questions I couldn't answer. My wife moved through the rooms like a shadow, her uniform folded neatly on the chair, her gaze distant, as though she had already stepped into another world. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but the weight in her eyes told me I wasn't ready for the answer. The tension with the HOA had escalated beyond petty disputes. It felt like something bigger was circling us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The days became a blur of whispered conversations with neighbors and uninvited, visits from strangers who claimed they were concerned members of the community. Their eyes darted around my home, lingering on things that weren't theirs to judge. I could see it. Rumors spreading like wildfire, each one twisting the truth into something darker. And behind it all, Karen's presence loomed, not in person, but in every sideways glance and quiet laugh I overheard. The more invisible she tried to make herself, the louder her influence became. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned orange, I found myself standing in the yard staring at the old wind chime that had once belonged to my father. It barely made a sound now, its strings tangled, its bells rusted. Yet there was something symbolic about it, silent, but still holding its place, refusing to fall. I remembered him telling me once, "People will try to drown you out, but even silence can be a statement." Those words clung to me, almost like a warning. It was then that the twist began to reveal itself, not with a shout, but with a whisper. A letter appeared in our mailbox. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper smudged with ink as though it had been written in a hurry. The words were short. "She's not who you think she is. Look closer before you trust her." There was no signature, no indication of who had left it. My heart pounded as I read it again and again, trying to untangle its meaning. At first, I thought it was just another attempt to sow fear. to break my confidence. But deep down, I knew it was pointing me somewhere. When I showed it to my wife, she barely blinked. She just set it down on the table and walked away, leaving me staring at her retreating back, unsettled by her calmness. That moment planted a seed of doubt I didn't want to admit to. What if the battles I thought we were fighting together were not what they seemed? What if the truth I had been clinging to was already fractured? A few nights later, I got my answer, or at least a piece of it. I was walking back from the store, the streets quiet, when I spotted a figure standing by the community center. At first, I thought it was Karen, but as I got closer, I realized it was one of the HOA board members, a man I had never seen at any of the heated meetings. He waved me over quickly, his movements nervous, as if he was afraid someone might see. His voice was low, broken by the kind of urgency you can't fake. "They're not telling you everything," he said. "Karen isn't acting alone. She has someone helping her, someone close to you. That's why things keep slipping, why they always seem to know your moves before you make them." His words hit me like a blow. I wanted to dismiss him, to call him paranoid, but something in his trembling hands and darting eyes told me he wasn't lying. And suddenly the letter made sense. I asked him who it was, but he just shook his head. "If I say it, I'll pay for it. Just watch carefully. The truth is closer than you think." Then he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with a storm rising inside me. Back at home, every glance at my wife felt different. Every pause in her words, every unanswered question began to carry more weight. My trust, once unshakable, started to tremble, and yet part of me refused to believe she could be tied to Karen in any way. She had stood by me, defended me, shielded me from humiliation. But what if her reasons weren't as simple as loyalty? What if she was protecting something else entirely? The breaking point came one stormy evening when I stumbled upon her phone left unlocked on the counter. I shouldn't have looked, but temptation overpowered me. My hands shook as I scrolled, and then I found it. A string of messages, not with Karen, but with someone else on the board. The words were coded, careful, but clear enough to show she had been feeding them details about my decisions, my plans, my vulnerabilities. My chest tightened as I read them, the world around me blurring. The betrayal burned, but so did the questions. Why? Why would she do this? I confronted her, and for the first time her mask cracked. Tears filled her eyes, but there was no denial. She admitted it, though not the way I expected. She told me she had been giving them information to protect me, to keep me from being crushed by the HOA's power. "If I didn't," she whispered, "they would have destroyed us already." I tried to control the damage. Her voice broke, and I couldn't tell if it was guilt or desperation that I was hearing. Her confession twisted everything I thought I knew. She had betrayed me, yes, but for reasons she believed were right. Doing good for bad reasons? Was that still betrayal? Or was it sacrifice? I couldn't decide. And in that confusion, a darker truth settled in. I wasn't sure who I could trust anymore. But the twist didn't end there. That very night, a loud knock rattled our front door. When I opened it, I found Karen herself standing there, her smile sharp, her eyes colder than I had ever seen. She didn't come alone. 2 men in suits flanked her, holding files in their hands. She leaned in, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Your wife's been very helpful," she said softly, just loud enough for me to hear, but now she's no longer useful. "It's your turn to make a choice. Either you cooperate, or everything you love crumbles." The words sliced through me, confirming every fear I had tried to silence. My wife's betrayal wasn't a hidden secret anymore. It was a weapon Karen had been waiting to use. And in that moment, I realized the game had shifted completely. The battle was no longer about fences, sheds, or neighborhood rules. It was about survival, about holding on to the fragments of truth in a storm of lies. As the rain pounded against the windows and Karen's voice lingered like poison in the air, I felt the walls closing in. Every choice ahead of me carried consequences I couldn't undo. Trust had become a dangerous gamble, and love itself felt like a double-edged blade. The story I thought I was living had been rewritten before my eyes, and the ending was nowhere in sight. Would I bend to their demands, or would I risk losing everything to stand my ground? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. The war had only just begun, and the twist had revealed enemies where I had once seen allies. The storm outside had not let up. Rain hammered the roof in sheets, and thunder rolled so close it shook the glass in the windows. But the real storm was inside my home, standing in my doorway in the shape of Karen, flanked by two silent men whose eyes never left me. Behind me, my wife hovered at the edge of the kitchen, pale and trembling, her hands clutched together as if she was praying for the moment to pass. The house felt smaller than ever, as if every wall was pressing in, every shadow waiting to consume us. Karen's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "You have one chance," she said, holding out a folder, its edges sharp, its weight heavy even from a distance. "Cooperate, and you get to keep your life the way it is. Refuse, and you'll lose everything you think you've built here. Your home, your reputation, even her." She tilted her chin toward my wife, smirking. Especially her. Her words lit a fire in me I had never felt before. For months I had been fighting shadows, rumors, faceless decisions made behind closed doors. But now the enemy had a face, a voice, and the arrogance to stand in my house and tell me my life wasn't mine. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the heat rising through my chest, but beneath the fury was something else. Fear. Not for myself, but for my wife, who had already crossed lines I couldn't yet forgive, and for the home that had become the symbol of everything we had endured. I didn't take the folder. Instead, I asked the question that had been burning since the night I found her messages. "What did you promise her?" My voice cracked, and I didn't care. "What did you give her to make her think betraying me was the only way?" Karen's smile widened. "The truth, of course. The truth that she couldn't protect you unless she bent. She did it out of love. Isn't that beautiful? Love makes people weak, predictable." I turned to my wife, and for a moment the storm outside disappeared. Her eyes were full of tears, but she didn't look away. "I thought I could manage it," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I thought I could feed them just enough to keep them off us, but it was never enough. And I didn't know how to stop." The silence that followed was more painful than any scream. It was the silence of broken trust, of two people standing on opposite sides of a line they never thought they'd cross. The gaze between us carried years of shared love, but also the sharp sting of betrayal. It was the kind of gaze that holds both pain and longing, like two souls trying to reach each other through glass. Karen stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood. She set the folder on the table with a deliberate thud. "This is the last offer you'll get. Take it, sign it, and life goes back to normal. Reject it, and the dam breaks." For a long moment, I stared at the folder. Inside were the papers that would strip me of my rights, hand over control, silence my voice. Signing it would mean surrender, but not signing it would mean war. A war I wasn't sure we could survive. The choice sat in front of me like a loaded weapon. And then, without thinking, I made the riskiest decision of my life. I pushed the folder back across the table toward her. "No." The word hung in the air, heavier than the storm, heavier than any silence. Karen's smile faltered just for a second, before she leaned back and crossed her arms. "Then you've chosen your own destruction," she said coldly. And she'll go down with you. The sound of my wife's sob tore through the room. She stepped forward, her voice breaking. You can't do this. You can't keep destroying lives because of your control. Karen tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction. Watch me. It was in that instant that my wife surprised me. She moved past me, standing directly in front of Karen, her body trembling but her stance firm. No more, she said, her voice stronger than I had ever heard it. I may have made mistakes, but I won't be your pawn anymore. If you want him, you'll have to go through me. The room froze. Even the suited men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Karen and my wife. For the first time, Karen's confidence wavered. Her smirk faltered, replaced by something sharper, anger. The confrontation that followed was not loud, but it was raw. Karen leaned in close, her voice low, venom dripping from every word. You think you can save him now? You've already ruined him. You've already given me everything I need, and my wife, with tears streaming down her cheeks, whispered back, Maybe I did. But you forgot one thing. I can take it back. Her words were not a threat, but a promise. And in that moment, I realized we were no longer just fighting for our home. We were fighting for the truth of who we were, for the chance to claw back something human from the claws of manipulation. Karen finally stepped back, fury flashing in her eyes. You'll regret this, she spat, motioning to the men to follow her. The door slammed behind them, leaving the storm as our only witness. The silence that followed was unbearable. My wife collapsed into the chair, her shoulders shaking, and I stood there, torn between anger and relief. She had betrayed me, yes, but she had also stood up to Karen when it mattered most. It was contradiction made flesh, love tangled with deception, loyalty tangled with fear. I wanted to hold her, to tell her we could still find a way forward, but part of me couldn't move. My hands felt heavy, my heart caught between forgiveness and doubt. The breaking point had come and we had survived it. But survival didn't erase the scars. That night I couldn't sleep. The storm finally quieted, but inside me the chaos raged on. I kept hearing Karen's voice, her warning that destruction was coming. I kept seeing my wife's face when she stood against her, brave but broken. And then, in the darkest hours of the night, I realized the final twist. On the table where Karen had left the folder, there was something she hadn't intended me to see. A single page had slipped out, half hidden beneath the others. I pulled it free, my hands trembling, and what I read sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't about my house. It wasn't about the HOA. It was about land deeds, hidden agreements, and a plan much larger than my property. Karen's fight with me was just a small piece of something vast, something dangerous, and my wife, whether knowingly or not, had been caught in the middle of it all. The climax had come and gone. The confrontation had burned like fire. But this truth was colder, sharper, more dangerous. Everything we thought was over was only the beginning of something darker. I folded the paper slowly, my hands shaking, and looked across the room at my wife, asleep in the chair, her face streaked with dried tears. We had faced Karen together. We had survived the night. But the war was not over. It had only changed shape, and in that quiet moment, I understood the cruelest twist of all. Sometimes winning one battle only means stepping into a bigger one, where the stakes are higher and the losses cut deeper. Would we survive that storm too? I didn't know. All I knew was that the truth had been revealed, and once revealed, it could never be undone. The house never felt the same after that night. Even when the storm passed and the skies cleared, a kind of stillness lingered in the walls, like the echoes of everything said and unsaid were stitched into the wood. I would walk from room to room, my hands brushing the familiar surfaces, and yet they felt altered, heavier with memory. My wife and I no longer spoke in rushed whispers or sharp accusations. Instead, silence became our language. A silence not of hostility, but of exhaustion. Two souls carrying too much weight to put into words. The folder remained on the table for days, untouched, though its presence was louder than any argument. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. The single page I had read told me enough to know that Karen's ambitions had always been about more than me, more than us, more than fences or sheds or bylaws. It was about power, and power never sleeps. We had cut her down once, but cutting one branch of a tree doesn't stop its roots from growing deeper. Neighbors came by less often after word spread about the confrontation. Some avoided me altogether, their eyes dropping to the ground when we crossed paths. Others lingered at the edge of the yard, offering quiet nods, as though to say they'd seen enough to understand but not enough to intervene. The HOA still held its meetings, but I stopped attending. There was nothing left to argue about. The war had shifted into shadows, and I had no interest in chasing ghosts. My wife tried in her way to bridge the distance between us. She cooked meals she knew I liked, left notes folded on the counter, and touched my hand when passing. But there was always hesitation, a pause in her movements, a question in her eyes. Love remained, but trust had become fragile glass. We both knew one wrong step could shatter it for good, and yet I couldn't let go of her. She had betrayed me, but she had also stood between me and destruction. Contradictions lived inside her, just as they lived inside me. Maybe that's what marriage really was. Not perfection, but choosing each other in spite of the cracks. Karen, for all her threats, grew quieter after that night. She didn't come to my door again. Instead, I would see her at a distance, across the street or standing at the edge of the community park. Her gaze sharp, her presence deliberate. It wasn't defeat. It was a reminder, a way of saying, I'm still here. Don't forget, and I didn't. Every time I saw her, a chill crawled up my spine. The war wasn't over. It had simply gone underground. The cost of it all was written in the small details. The wind chime in the yard finally broke loose during another storm, its rusted bells falling into the dirt. I buried them at the base of the old tree out back, the one my father had planted. It felt symbolic somehow, laying silence to rest beneath something still growing. My wife stood beside me as I covered the bells with soil. Neither of us spoke, but in that act, I think we both understood that the past couldn't be fixed. It could only be carried forward, reshaped into something new. At night, I sometimes dreamed of the confrontation, replaying the moment I pushed the folder back toward Karen. In those dreams, I would sometimes sign it, sometimes burn it, sometimes tear it to pieces. Each version left me waking with my chest tight, gasping for breath, as if the choice had never truly left me. Maybe it never will. Maybe that's the real punishment. Not the war itself, but the way it plants itself in your mind and refuses to let go. But life continued in its stubborn, imperfect way. Grass still grew, neighbors still argued about parking spaces, children still rode their bikes down the street. The world moved on, even when I didn't feel ready to. That, too, was a kind of truth, the cruel but necessary one. And as the days turned to weeks, and weeks into months, I found myself standing in the yard one evening, watching the sun dip low and paint the sky in fire. My wife stood beside me, close but not touching. We didn't say anything, but for the first time in a long while, the silence felt less like distance and more like peace. The final image I carry, the one that will stay with me long after the battles blur into memory, is simple. It is of the sun setting behind the houses the HOA built, their windows catching the light, glowing as if on fire. And there in that glow I saw both loss and possibility. The ruins of trust, yes, but also the faint outline of rebirth. The world had changed. We had changed. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Because some wars don't end with victory or defeat. They end with survival. And survival, no matter how scarred, is its own kind of triumph. If this story pulled you in, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to show your support and subscribe to HOA Truth Tales for more real neighborhood battles and shocking twists you won't forget. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in this situation? I'll be reading every response. Until next time, remember, in every community, there's more truth hiding behind closed doors than you think.